All right, everybody. Hi, I'm Richard Thompson, and I'm a man of many bow ties and a member of the All Souls Unitarian Universalist Forum Committee. Welcome to the All Souls Forum. Our mission is to provide a platform for the discussion of significant issues, especially those affecting ethical values in our contemporary world, and to promote critical thinking. In the time of COVID-19, we will be meeting via Zoom until it is safe and permissible for us to join at church again. We recognize the limitations of the Zoom platform. However, we are confident that we can provide quality programs. This morning, it is my privilege and honor to introduce Gary Kuntz from the National Storytelling Network, who will be talking about the power and impact of storytelling, as well as a few local groups and national groups you can get involved in if you're interested. When Gary is finished, then we will have Q&A. With that, Gary, take it away.
Thank you, Richard. Have you noticed the word story is popping up everywhere? It's being attached to almost everything. This book is a good story. Okay, I can believe that. This movie is a story. Maybe. Commercials. There's even a new television station in Kansas City called Story.tv, which I looked at some of their programming and I haven't seen anything with real stories in it yet. Just tell you how ubiquitous this is, it's even in a piece of project management software that I use, where they use the term story instead of the simple words project description. Which led me to ask a couple of questions. What is a story? Now, the answer will be different for everybody, but it's an important question. What is a story? And then why is everybody using that word today? I'm on the board of directors of 3 storytelling organizations: the National Storytelling Network, NSN, Missouri Storytelling, MOTEL, that's MO-TELL, and River and Prairie Story Weavers, RAPS. And you'll get more information about these groups later on in the talk, but I'm saying this not to say that I volunteer way too much, but that I know a lot of storytellers. Everybody from somebody who just wants to tell a story to their children or grandchildren or just a friend, to full-time professionals. And if you asked them that question, what is a story? You would get a wide variety of answers. I know people that have a narrow view of that question. They say a story is a traditional tale, which means it's a folklore tale, mythology, or fairy tale, and it's told via the spoken word. And according to them, nothing else fits the definition of story. Others with a wider view say a story can be found in almost anything: a book, a song, poetry, movies, painting, a play, just about any medium that people use to convey information and emotion. Personally, I tend to lean towards the latter view, with the understanding that not all books or poetry or movies or whatever actually have a story in them. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to define the term story relatively narrowly like this. A story is a narrative that takes the listener on a journey via their mind's eye. A narrative that takes the listener on a journey, which means the listener has to use their imagination to fill in the pieces of the story that aren't explicitly defined. And to go back to my sentence that says not all books, songs, stories, whatever, have a story in them, I want you to consider these two songs. Dolly Parton's song, A Coat of Many Colors. Hopefully some of you have heard it. She's talking about growing up poor, and her mother has made her a coat of scrap fabric, and she wore it to school so proudly, and the kids laughed at her. To me, that fit the definition of a story. I could follow her in that journey. Another song, a song I like, and that's catchy, Louie Louie. I think I can safely say that's not a story. They don't have a story in there. They just have a catchy rhythm and music to dance to and to get upbeat about. So not all songs have stories, not all pictures, not all movies. And as for the second question, why is everyone using that word story to attach to something, to describe something? That deals with, excuse me, that deals with the science behind the brain and how stories and storytelling affects the brain. Now, if you're interested, go ahead and Google the terms neuroscience and story, and there are hundreds of references. I'm going to read off a few tidbits from the references that I thought was especially interesting. Our brains like stories because clear narratives cut through distractions. Stories help us pay attention, particularly in this attention deficit era, when vying for people's focus is more coveted than ever. Which makes me wonder, that ballot thing that you got in the mail, did it have a little bit of story in there? One study said, our brains are hardwired to hear and understand stories and narrative. Our instinct for story is a survival skill. Through stories, we can cooperate creatively because the story helps us understand what the other person wants to accomplish. It makes the concept stick in our minds. This was especially important before widespread community literacy occurred, and the only way of conveying information was via the spoken word. You had to have something that stuck in that person's mind, especially when you got to abstract concepts. And this last one I found interesting, though it may be boring. Cognitive neuroscientists have documented that narratives trigger a release of neurotransmitters that affect both hemispheres of the brain. An experiment by researchers at Princeton University, they took somebody who told a story and somebody who listened to the story and put them under MRI scans at the same time. And then they observed what the brain was doing while the story was being told and while the story was being listened to. And what they found surprised them. That the person listening to this story connected the forebrain, the frontal cortex of the brain, with the emotional limbic region of the midbrain. Okay, they kind of expected that. But what they didn't expect was the exact same response was occurring in the person telling the story. They were doing a thing that they call neurocoupling, where both people were thinking similarly, which explains why the term story is being used everywhere. It's an attempt to get you to remember what was presented and to create a bond between you and the presenter. Because if that bond can be created, you're more apt to believe that presenter's viewpoint. Okay, out of the science part now. Over the history of recorded stories, and well before that time, I believe, was to teach something. You use a story to teach something. I can imagine a group of cavemen and cavewomen gathered around, and they're repeating what happened that day with the hunting and gathering. And they're telling each other via a story what happened, whether good, whether bad, and how to repeat what went well. Kind of, stay away from the saber-toothed tigers. They don't like being prodded with spears. When you pick this plant, it tastes really good. When you pick this plant, it makes you itch like mad. And if you think I'm being fanciful about going back that far, what do you think cave paintings are? Petroglyphs. And they're around the world. France, Australia, Africa. They're an attempt to share a story of what happened. Now, next one's my opinion, but once we get to recorded history, who do you think is the most widely known and oftentimes quoted storyteller? I think it's Aesop from Aesop's Fables. I think almost everybody has heard an Aesop fable. He was a slave in the 6th century BC, and he told fables, short stories, to get his point across, to teach something. As a slave, he couldn't just come out right and say, no, you have to do this. So he wrapped it in a story. One of his stories that I think almost everybody probably has heard is the story about the mouse and the lion, where the lion spares the mouse's life, and later on the mouse saves the lion from the trap. That story is 2,800 years old, and people still repeat it today. I think that one has withstood the test of time. And by the way, Aesop, if you ever read his fables, he never said, and the moral of the story is. Those were added by later publishers. He couldn't tell people what the moral of the story was because he was a slave. He couldn't speak that directly to people. He had to leave it for the people to figure it out for themselves. Now, there's an old adage that says, if you want someone to remember something, tell them a story. I had this proven to me several years ago when I was asked to tell stories at a high school special education class. I'd never told to this type of audience before. And I had asked the teacher ahead of time, what age range stories would they understand? And she hemmed and hawed a little bit and said, third grade level. Remember, this is a high school class. I said, okay, great. I've got lots of third grade level stories. No problem. I can do that. And then I did my usual preparation, which meant I had 3 hours of stories prepared for a 45-minute session. I come into the classroom and I find out they had combined 3 classes together. What they called the higher functioning students, those that could possibly get a job, maybe live on their own or at least in a group home. The lower functioning students, which probably would never get a job or never live on their own. And then, just for fun, they added the behavior disorder students. It was an interesting audience mix. In fact, one of the behavior disorder students, he stood up and says, I'm not going to listen to no stories. And he picked up his chair, turned it, set it so his back was to me, which really embarrassed the teachers. And they started to get over to move him around. I said, just leave him. It'll be fine. And I proceeded to tell a story, third grade level. They appeared to understand it. They laughed in the right places and everything. But I could tell they wanted something more. So I jumped it to a 5th grade level story. And you can tell the same story, but in different ways for different age levels. Again, they understood it. And they wanted more. And by this time, that one special ed student, he's looking over his shoulder and his chair is slowly turning around. So I did a story that I would normally tell to middle school students. Same results. And so I thought, why not? And I tried a story that I would tell to any regular high school presentation I was doing. And they understood it. Now, did they understand it perfectly? Probably not. Do all regular high school students understand the story perfectly? Probably not. But that was what they wanted. They wanted that content. And the rest of the set that I did was regular high school stories. And after the show, I talked to the teacher, said, this is what I'd done because she noticed the stories were changing. I said, they understood them. So what they wanted. I thanked her. She thanked me. I left and I thought, that's interesting. Next day, I get a call, and I could tell it was a student being coached by the teacher who said, Mr. Kuntz, we liked your stories. Would you come back next month, which would be October, and tell us stories, ghost stories? Well, how can you refuse that? So I told her, yes, I would do that. Let me talk to the teacher, and I'll arrange time. Talk to the teacher. We arranged a date and time. And I said, I'm just going to do what I would do for regular high school students, which the stories can be somewhat gross sometimes. Some are funny. Some are actually scary. And she said, okay. A little bit doubting, but I went in and we had a great time. I mean, I told stories like Rats in the Graveyard. Yeah, you can pretty well know where that story's going just from the title. The Red Dress, the Monkey's Paw, things like that. And they understood them. They reacted well to the stories. We finished. I was talking to the teacher, and this young man comes up to me, waits, teacher acknowledges him, and he goes, Mr. Kuntz, I liked your stories today, but I really liked that story from last month. And he proceeded to tell me the story. Now, was it word for word? No, but he had the story down. I'm used to this if I go into elementary schools on a regular basis. Sometimes I'd go in month to month at some classes, and the students want to repeat those stories to me. It's like, okay. He finished. I said, well, you have that story down well. Feel free to tell it to anybody. That's a good job. He said, thank you. And he turned and left. And I looked over, and the teacher's head was cocked to one side. And I said, he's got that story down pretty well. He's a good storyteller. And she goes, yeah. But he can't remember his address or phone number from week to week. We work on it all week, and by Friday he can remember it, and by Monday he's forgotten it again. But yet he remembered the story from a month ago. Somehow that story stuck where the instruction didn't. My wife was an IA, instructional assistant, in that class, which is why I was invited there the first time. And she came home and I talked to her about this. So she started creating stories around the concepts that they were teaching the students. For the address, she created a story about, I want to come trick-or-treating at your house, but I don't know where it's at. All of a sudden, they could remember their address after they went through this because it was wrapped in a story. Phone number. I think she did something with ordering a pizza. Cooking some things. She wrapped a story around that. And it was interesting because she had half the class and another IA had another half the class. She's teaching via story. The other IA is teaching traditionally. Her students are remembering these concepts, and the other IA students aren't. That power of story was helping with comprehension. Now, many people say, well, that's fine and well for you to do. I mean, you're a professional. You've told stories all of your life. But I can't tell stories. I didn't tell stories all my life. Trust me, I am an introvert. My theme used to be, you can drag me to the front of the classroom, but you can't make me speak. But one day I just was reading in the local paper and I saw a little blurb, a tiny little blurb saying, Steve Otto, storyteller, is going to tell stories at the First National Bank of Missouri in Gladstone. Well, I live in Gladstone. I thought that was an odd place to tell stories. As it turns out, Steve wasn't telling stories. He was recruiting for one of those groups that I mentioned earlier. And that's how I got involved with storytelling. Now, does everybody want to tell stories the same way? No. Some people just want to be able to tell a story that somebody listens to like I said, their children, a friend, whatever. And some people don't mind being in front of a stage telling stories. It took me a while to get to the being on a stage telling a story part. But I enjoy it because I enjoy seeing the reactions of the people that are listening. Now, resources for storytelling. At the beginning, I said I'm on the board of directors for 3 organizations. The National Storytelling Network, also known as NSN. NSN's is I say national, but It's actually an international group of storytellers because we have several members from around the world. And its main goal is to help and promote storytelling and to help and promote those that tell those stories. It's a place where all these different individual groups can come together, share information, and then disseminate it back. NSN puts on many events a year. Because of Richard here, NSN partnered with the Irish Center in March to tell stories and have music at Drexel Hall. Irish Center wasn't quite certain because I don't think they ever had a program devoted to storytelling before. I think it went well. The audience there seemed to really, really appreciate it. And we're talking about doing it again next year. If you're into things like Earth Day, ecological things, on April 8th through the 10th, there's a conference that NSM is sponsoring called Earth Up. It combines stories and science about our environment with the themes of eco-justice, action, and hope. This will be the second year the conference has gone on. And I think personally that it's going to be really interesting. The link for the NSN website is storynet.org, and it either is in the chat now or will be there very shortly. Or you can do storynet.org/earthup, all one word. But if you go just to storynet.org, you can scroll down and you'll see where the link for Earth Up is. I hope that you take a look at this. Look at what else NSN is doing, and I hope that you join us. Next organization is Missouri Storytelling, Inc. It's also known as MOTEL, M-O-T-E-L-L. And this is a statewide organization of storytellers with, again, its function is to help people and groups learn and to publicize what is happening with storytelling in the state of Missouri. One of the activities it sponsors is storytelling in state parks. One of our members feels passionately about that and donated money so storytellers could get paid to go tell in state parks. The state parks choose which tellers they want from a list and which parks get them. Try to do about 12 a year. An upcoming event being sponsored by Motel is occurring on April 5th, which is this Tuesday at 7 p.m. It's a show titled April Showers May Bring Mayflowers, or not. It's a virtual-only show over the Zoom platform, and it's free. If you're interested, go to motel.org, mo-tell.org, and again, the link will probably magically appear in the chat. You can see the flyer, who the tellers are, and at the bottom, you can see the link for the registration. This is a two-part process. You register via Zoom, and once you register, Zoom will send you the actual link to the event to the email you provided. We do this to reduce the chance of Zoom bombing. At one of our shows before we did this, we had a nasty example of Zoom bombing. It sounded like middle school students just saying actually really hateful things about the storyteller who was speaking at that moment. The other organization I belong to, and the first one I joined, It's called River and Prairie Story Weavers, RAPS. Now, it's a local/regional group with most of its members in western Missouri and eastern Kansas. This is the group that helped me develop my style as a storyteller. Every storyteller tells stories differently, or I should say, every successful storyteller tells stories differently. They tell the stories they like. They tell the stories in their way. It's a good place to practice your stories because we have open storytelling. You get feedback only if you want the feedback, only if you request it. Now, RAPS doesn't have any shows scheduled this month, but we do have 2 meetings on the first Thursday of the month, which is April 7th at 7 p.m., and on the third Saturday of the month, which is April 16th at 10:30 a.m. And these meetings are hybrid, both in person and virtual. So you can choose which way you want to join. If you want to come in person, the meeting is at the Trailside Center at 9901 Holmes, which is in South Kansas City. The third Saturday meeting is at the Woodneath branch of the Mid-Continent Public Library, which is up north near Liberty, and that's at 10:30 a.m. One other place to learn stories is at the Mid-Continent Public Library. They're a wonderful resource on how to learn how to tell stories. The Woodneath branch of the library also has the Story Center. Mid-Continent Library thought stories were so important, they created a separate story center. I was part of a program at a retirement home. Audience was appreciative. We finished, got down, started talking to people, and all of a sudden I had this tugging on my shirt sleeve. And I looked down and I somehow had a little old lady attached to my shirt sleeve. And she was not going to let go. She says, come on, you got to meet her. You got to meet her. You got to hear what she says. You got to meet her. Come on. And she led me through the audience all the way to the back where there were a row of ladies sitting. And she walked up to one, said, you got to tell them the story. You got to tell them the story. And this lady stood up. And I mean, if she was 5 foot tall, she was probably wearing heels. And if she weighed 90 pounds, she had heavy jewelry on, impeccably dressed, bright blue eyes, and she looked at me and she started to say, at the end of World War II, I was crossing the Mediterranean on a British warship. And she spoke in a Germanic type accent, which got my mind going all of a sudden way off on tangents. Why was she on a British warship? And it became evident to the story it was sent just for her. On their first day out of port, she was escorted up to the captain. He welcomed her, and then she said, Captain, where are the women's facilities? And the captain, being very British, straightened up and said, Madam, this is a British man of war. There are no separate women's facilities. For the duration of this trip, I reserved the head in my cabin, the toilet, for your use. She thanked him, was escorted away. A little bit later, she came back. She said, Captain, where are the women's shower facilities? And the captain, again, straightening up, said, Madam, this is a small British man of war. There are no separate shower facilities. You'll just have to do without a shower until we get to port. That'll be about 5 days. And with that, she straightened up, and she couldn't have been like 20 years old maybe, and said, I will not stay on this hot and dirty ship without a shower. So they came to a compromise. The next morning at shower time, wearing a robe donated by a junior officer, she walked down the corridor below decks towards the shower facility, past a line of British seamen standing at attention, the towel over their left arm, holding a bar of soap in their right arm, looking straight ahead. She got to take her shower first. She went in, started her shower. Well, the Mediterranean can be a rough sea. And this is a small British warship. And apparently some soap might have been involved, but she slipped and out she went into the corridor in front of all those men dressed in a few soap suds. And then she stopped. And my mind is just like, what happened? And finally I said, what happened? She says, I did the only thing I could. I laughed. And when I laughed, they all laughed. I got back up, went in, and finished my shower. And for the rest of the voyage, any of those men that were in that corridor, if they saw her around the ship, they would point and laugh. Wonderful story. I had questions, and I was getting ready to answer them, and all of a sudden, another little old lady who wanted to say how much she liked the story. I talked to her for just what felt like a minute, maybe two. Thanked her, turned to look at the other lady, and she had disappeared. I mean, I went to the entrance of the room. She wasn't in the hallways. I have no idea how they got out of there that fast, but the whole group had left. But I wanted to know why she was on that ship. And I knew she came to these shows, and we had another show being planned for 3 months. So I made sure my name was down to tell stories. And that day, I told stories. I'm standing on the stage looking around, and I spotted her with that group of women in the back. The set finished. I mean, I made a beeline, and I kept my arms in close. No more tugging. I walked up in front of her, said, excuse me, ma'am. I told stories here a couple of months ago, but then you told me a story about crossing the Mediterranean. Why were you on this British warship? And she just kind of looked at me, and those bright blue eyes weren't bright. And she was like, British warship? Yeah, you were on the Mediterranean. Mediterranean? Why was I there? And then, and I turned, and it was one of her friends who just leaned up close to me and said, the poor thing's had a stroke, and she can't remember her past. And I realized at that moment, I would never know why she was on that ship. I didn't even know her name. And maybe it's just as well. Maybe the mystery is more important to me than trying to do the research to try to find it. But that's why you need to tell your stories now. Because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. For millennia, story has been used to communicate, to entertain, to teach, and most of all, to make that connection between two people. Story, in all of its forms, however you wish to define it, and everyone will define it differently for themselves. But story has withstood the test of time. And I believe it is still as valid today as it was back with those cave people. And that concludes the talk.
All right. Thank you for that, Gary. That was very powerful. Good. I see Mike Coey's already got his hand raised.
Yeah, it seems to me that the stories of some pre-literate people or pre-literate societies seem to have less valor or validity than the stories of people with a written tradition, like the Israelites or maybe the Islamic peoples or the Hindu people. And I'm wondering, why is it that people who traditionally have not had a written language seem to have their stories devalued that way?
I think it goes back to that remembering. If you don't have your stories written down, you have a much smaller audience for those stories, because your audience is only those people that have heard that story. And unfortunately, we don't value things that we haven't heard or we haven't read. And it's harder for us to put ourselves in the place of when those stories were told, in those times and in that culture. So we just don't value that much. Now, there are areas of the world where the tradition of oral storytelling is continued and those stories are valued. And in fact, an older book actually referenced it. Have you read Fahrenheit 451? Where their way of preserving the stories was to memorize them and then burn the book.
Gary, can you please speak to storytelling showcases and other things that we've done that involve marginalized groups like women, LGBTQ, people and racial and religious minorities?
I don't know of all the events. I just know that it's important that everyone, and I mean everyone, whether LGBTQ, whether somebody from political spectrums that I don't agree with, but everyone has to have that opportunity to tell their stories. Because it's through telling the stories that a culture says what's important to them. If you choose to tell stories, the stories you've picked show what's important to you. And NSN believes that everybody's voice is valid and everybody's voice needs to be heard. Because if you don't hear all the varieties of stories, how can you understand or start to understand somebody else's point of view?
Phyllis, why don't you go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, Gary, this is a speculative question. I was interested in what you said about the linkage in the brain with storytelling. So that leads me to ask, what do you think would happen if, when you met your little tiny blue-eyed lady that couldn't remember, If you had told her the story, do you think that would have brought back her memory?
Possibly in the future, because I actually did, when I was talking with her, go through probably half, maybe 2/3 of the stories she told me. I mean, and she told me this story over 15 years ago, and it's stuck with me ever since. At the time when I did it, it may be the effects of the stroke were too recent that she couldn't make that connection. But unfortunately, as we know, sometimes the effects of a stroke are so catastrophic that it effectively severs that link. And the brain doesn't have any way of getting around, that link is severed and the brain can't figure out another routing through it. Sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. I suspect just from her physical appearance and the way her friends were hovering that she probably didn't survive for too much longer. But I don't know.
Oh, too bad. Well, maybe you have a future with stroke patients.
I have some friends who have told in psych wards. My wife actually has told in a psych place. I've told in juvenile detention facilities and all the way up through maximum security prisons, using stories for teaching and for understanding. They work. Now, some of these people are not people I would ever have consciously thought of as a place where I needed to tell a story. But when you tell someone a story, if you have the time afterwards, oftentimes it triggers them to tell you a story.
Right.
And I don't know, I'm hoping when I was telling a couple of those stories, people were thinking, that's similar to what I went through. I have a story about that.
Well, that's the best of conversation.
Yes.
Mike, you're up.
Yeah, another question I have is, it seems as far as the validity issue, all my life I've heard, well, those people tell stories, but we have the truth. And I wonder, how come telling stories always seemed to have the connotation of something that wasn't quite as accurate?
That's because in the storytelling community, there was an adage: never let the truth get in the way of a good story. I personally disagree with that adage. Mine is never let the facts get in the way of a good story. The story has to be true. You just may have rearranged some of the facts around it. And that's why the validity sometimes of oral storytelling is not, or the oral storytelling is not considered to be as valid as something written in a book. Because oral storytelling will change with each retelling. Somebody adds something, somebody takes something out, a different point of view. Whereas if it's printed, you only ever get that one viewpoint. Now, whether the oral story is more valid than the printed story, maybe, maybe not. I can't say that the printed story is more valid. Just because somebody wrote it down in print doesn't mean that it was true. But I don't think the printed story, unless it engages that imagination, that listener or that reader's imagination, will stick as well as the oral story.
One more question before we end the recorded period. It looks like somebody dropped in the chat. Do any of your members sing their stories?
Yes. There are as many different ways to tell the stories or to get that emotion across as there are storytellers. Some members do sing. Some members do poetry. Cowboy poetry is a subset of storytelling. If you've listened to good cowboy poetry, there is a narrative in that story, in that poem. A lot of poems have that narrative. Some drum, some dance. I don't know all the ways. I don't think I can describe everything, but basically, if you are interested in doing it that way, then do the story that way.
I do want to remind everyone that next week, Tricia DeGraff will be speaking on arts and transformative education.
Let me finish before you take the break. My mentor always said there are 3 things that you have to have in a story. You have to start that story. You have to have a plot line, a storyline. And I apologize because I realized I did my fingers in the wrong order. And you have to end that story. Everything else is up to you.